so much for joining the USIBC's discussion of post-election perspectives on the U.S. India partnership. 2020 has been a year to defy all expectations and all conventions. We started the year with the historic visit of President Trump to India. And yet, even as the two leaders were meeting, the attention of the world was fast turning to the coronavirus pandemic. And today, the year winds down, and as we gather to discuss the just concluded U.S. elections, COVID-19 is again grabbing the headlines as it surges across Asia, Europe, and the United States. The U.S.-India partnership is one that has been prioritized by both countries, and one that has been advanced by successive administrations and political leaders across the spectrum, in the U.S. and in India. The power and the potential of this relationship is not just in how we can strengthen and support each other, but, as Prime Minister Modi has put it, in the way that a U.S.-India partnership can tackle global challenges and benefit the global community. COVID-19 is one such challenge, as is our changing climate. India has long been a key supporter of a rules-based global order and one that invests in and strengthens global institutions. An incoming Biden administration that seeks to strengthen international alliances, reform and revitalize international institutions, and tackle these challenges will want India by its side. Today's program brings together leading voices in the United States, including Senators Warner and Cornyn, a leading voice in the House who was to join us, Representative Ami Bera, was called away at the last moment due to the House leadership elections, which are underway this morning. Ambassador Rich Verma, Dr. Mehul Mehta, Safiya Gori Ahmad, Amos Hochstein, Dr. Kurt Campbell, all here to share their insights and perspectives. We're grateful for the support and sponsorship of Aiken Gump and our board member Prakash Mehta, who is here. But to get us started, let me turn the program over to the chairman of the board of the U.S. India Business Council and the executive chairman of Nuveen, Mr. Vijay Advani. Vijay, over to you.
Thank you, Nisha, and good morning and good evening to everyone tuning in at this very timely event. 2020 presidential elections is one that captured the attention not only of the entire country, but the entire world, including the world's largest democracy, India. The fact that Vice President-elect has Indian roots, has also energized and excited the US-India corridor. But it must be said at the outset that those of us who have worked on advancing US-India ties, either from government or the private sector, it is a relationship that has always enjoyed bipartisan support. Today's event is a critical opportunity for us to hear from some of the policy leaders who are shaping this partnership. President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris' definitive victory in the US elections starts yet another chapter in defining the next stage of partnerships between the two countries. For the next 2 months and moving forward, there'll be new priorities set forth and new ideas of strengthening engagement for the two countries to collaborate on. While there has been significant developments over the past decade and a half, there are key areas that have shifted in priority between the Obama and the Trump administration. From the vantage point of the US India Business Council, we have identified 3 ways to look at what Congress and the Biden-Harris administration should focus on. So let me elaborate. What to build on, what is pending that needs acceleration, and what can future collaboration and priorities include. Let me touch upon these briefly and set the context for today's discussion. So first, what to build on. US and India have made significant progress on the defense ties and energy partnership, and in advancing the strategic cooperation through dialogue like the 2+2 or the Quad. The Biden-Harris administration will have to identify what pieces have worked and double down on them. For example, the U.S. India security cooperation has been one of the most meaningful and sustained anchors of the relationship. All the way from the U.S. India civil nuclear deal to India being named a major defense partner in 2016, to the signing of the 3 foundational defense agreements, have all culminated in India being a strong security partner in the Indo-Pacific. This security partnership needs to be nurtured and built upon with greater interportability of our military and defense industries. U.S.-India energy relationships is another leg on which the bilateral relationship stands. The Trump administration prioritized energy cooperation, particularly in oil and the gas sector. But there is more to be done in areas like renewable energy, electrification, and technology for smart grids for cities, a priority that remains consistent on the India side. Now, looking on what is nascent that needs acceleration. Despite movement, and forward movement is recognized, there are key elements of the trade between the two countries that remain unresolved. It will be critical for both the Modi administration and the incoming Biden administration to look at dissecting the trade deal to elements of which can be elements which can be completed, elements which need further review, and set forth a timeline that can help boost a two-way trade between the two countries that sits at close to 145 billion today. And then finally, moving on to what can be the two countries work on together. Here is, frankly, the element of the relationship I'm most excited about. The U.S.-India relationship is not the same it was 4 years ago, let alone 10, 20, or 30 years ago. Entering 2021, the world has changed significantly, and so can the U.S.-India corridor priorities. I think there's a great excitement on a few fronts. First, the climate change and clean energy. Prime Minister Modi remains committed in infusing the Indian power and energy sector with renewable energy, with Indian states making significant progress, adding solar, wind, and other distributed renewables into their grid. Yet, India is grappling with crippling levels of pollution. While there has been a lull in the climate dialogue between the two countries, President-elect Biden has identified this as a key priority, especially in the context of the United States' relationship with India. The private sector will play a key role in addressing the technology and financing gaps to advance climate, green growth, and sustainability initiatives between the two nations. Second, health cooperation. There is no greater need than the intellectual, technical, and innovative expertise of both nations to help manage the COVID-19 crisis, not only from an economic perspective, but more prominently, the health aspect. Even beyond COVID-19, there is tremendous scope for development of new therapies and medication, joint research capabilities, technical exchanges in developing a stronger, more robust digital health ecosystem, and providing last mile connectivity on healthcare services. Within COVID-19, the dissemination of an effective vaccine to the population will be a key leading to an accelerated development and focus on cold chains and redesigning supply chain efficiencies and expertise. Third, strategic digital partnership. We are seeing a growth in digital trade, one marked by new technology, cross-border flow of data, and increased e-commerce opportunities. If the COVID experience has taught us anything, it is that the digital economy and technology adaptation is ushering in a new world and a new economic reality. The US and India must align their economic and strategic interest to launch a strategic digital partnership. And fourthly and lastly, integrating India more into a global supply chain. As companies look to de-risk and diversify their supply chains, India can be an attractive destination. However, both governments will need to work together to remove some of the barriers to trade and investments, as well as identify mechanisms for addressing the infrastructure gaps. So to conclude, let me make a bold statement. The US-India relationship can indeed fulfill its potential to be one of the defining partnerships of the 21st century. But it will require a partnership between industry and government, where both countries realize a full promise of this important relationship. The board of the USIBC, Nisha, her team, and I are ready to do our part. And today we will hear from some of the leaders in a view from the Hill. So without further ado, let me pass it back to Prakash Mehta to get us going. Prakash?
Thank you, Vijay. Thanks for all of your leadership of the USIBC as our chairman, and of course to our steadfast and tireless leader, Nisha Biswal. Being a member of many of these organizations, I can say that through Nisha's leadership this year in particular, the pace of activity at USIBC in terms of the US-India partnership hasn't slowed at all. So thanks to Nisha and her team at USIBC. There's a famous quote that I think applies to 2020. Someone once said, there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are years when decades happen. So it strikes me that 2020 is such a year where more than a decade worth of activity has happened. As far as the calendar of that year is concerned, as we march to the conclusion of the year we've all been waiting for, here we are in a time sandwich. We are between, of course, Diwali and Thanksgiving. So happy Diwali and happy Thanksgiving to all of our audience here in the US and in India. And we're also between an election and inauguration, a period which before this year we used to call the lame duck period. But obviously this particular lame duck period has already been full of excitement, and we still have 2 months to go before the anticipated inauguration of President-elect Biden on January the 20th, 2021. My job is a simple one today. I'm here to introduce our panelists, whom we're lucky to have. First, we have Rich Verma, the former US ambassador to India from 2014 to 2017, a name many of you will know. Among many other things, that embassy of the United States is the largest in terms of personnel. So Rich's job was not just to link the countries, but obviously also to look after a very large office. So look forward to hearing Rich's thoughts about India from that perspective. Rich is now moved on to Mastercard, where he runs their public policy initiatives. Then let me move to our guests of honor, Senator John Cornyn and Senator Mark Warner. Senator John Cornyn, the senator from Texas, is well known to many of us here in the United States for his leadership over the last 18 years or so in the Senate on a variety of issues, including his role with respect to US-India business relations. As Senator Cornyn will know, our firm, Aiken Gump, an international law firm, has its roots in Texas, and our founders always taught me that Texas got to be so important in large part, because of how business-minded it is. So Senator John Cornyn is there to carry forward those important roots of Texas, and we're delighted to have him here. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia is also with us. I'm very happy to say I am now a Virginia resident, and so just a couple of weeks ago, Senator Warner, I was lucky enough to cast my early in-person voting ballot for you a couple of blocks over in Arlington. Congratulations to you, Senator, on your victory, and to Senator Cornyn too. I believe Senator Cornyn is starting his 4th term, and Senator Warner is, I believe, starting his 3rd term or thereabouts. So very happy to have you with us too, Senator Warner, speaking on behalf of Virginia, and you, Senator Cornyn, speaking on behalf of Texas, but more importantly, on behalf of the United States. So finally, I'll just close by saying that yes, this is a bipartisan event, and we're delighted to have senators from both sides of the aisle representing the country in the context of this important discussion. But it's also an event with two very business-minded senators. So it's not just bipartisan, but it's business-minded. And I think that's going to be critical to the way we carry forward U.S.-India relations in the next administration and over the next couple of years. Last but not least, I want to just mention a few of my colleagues who are on the line with us today. Two of them are former senators and congresspeople in their own right, so they will be well known to Senator Cornyn and Senator Warner. We have with us Senator Joe Donnelly of Indiana, who's now a partner in Aiken Gump on the Democratic side, and we have Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Lehtinen on the Republican side, former chairwoman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the House of Representatives. So glad to have both of them with us. And last but not least, for you, Senator Cornyn, we have someone to whom I know you're quite close. We have our partner, Senior Advisor Hans Rickoff, who's here with us too. So without further ado, why don't I turn it right over to Rich to help us moderate a discussion about post-election perspectives. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rich.
Okay, well, let's get right to it. Prakash, thank you. Senators, good morning. Thank you for being here. Thanks for your outstanding leadership on U.S.-India relations over so many years. But maybe I'll just start with what's happening in the Senate. It's a busy time. The transition appears to be stuck, but the Senate seems to be moving. Can you give us a sense of what's on the agenda for the lame duck? Do you see a potential stimulus in the works given what's happening with COVID and the kind of cracks in the economy? Senator Cornyn, you want to go first?
Oh, I was hoping Senator Warner would enlighten us. But let me take a stab and he can clean up after I comment. Obviously, there are things we have to do, which is to keep the lights on. And we have a continuing resolution that expires December the 11th. And my hope is that our appropriations committees can come together with an omnibus appropriation bill that will keep us up and running through the end of the next fiscal year. There does seem to be some renewed interest in another COVID-19 bill. I think that would be a very positive development because not only are we on the cusp of seeking to deploy some of the vaccines that have now been announced that once they're certified by the FDA as being safe and effective, we also are still suffering from the economic fallout associated with mitigation efforts. So my hope is we can do both of those things. And then Senator Warner and I are working on another little project that has to do with enticing semiconductor manufacturing to come back on shore in the United States. We have a number of wonderful semiconductor companies in the United States, but very few foundries are being built. I think one now in Arizona through the Taiwan Semiconductor Company, but China is building 16 of them at the same time. So that's another little project that we're working on, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that we'll be able to make some progress there.
That's great.
Well, Rich, let me pick up. First of all, thank you, and thank Nisha and USIBC and Prakash. Thank you for casting a vote, and proud to have you in Arlington. And John and I are very proud of being co-chairs of USIBC, or U.S. India Caucus. We're up to 42 members. We are still proud to be the largest bilateral caucus in the Senate, and we hope to grow our numbers, under a Biden administration. I want to echo what John said about we will do the appropriations bill. I think we will do the defense authorization bill, which will include our CHIPS proposal on semiconductors. We also, John and I are working together on a 5G proposal to on an international basis, counter the challenges that China and Huawei specifically present. I do hope, Rich, we can come together on a stimulus package. I think, and I don't want to discourage the record run up in the marketplace, but I think the market is really disconnected from the reality that many families are living through. And so much of the support, whether unemployment expires December 31, state and local government aid expires December 31, rental forbearance, student loan forbearance, mortgage forbearance. We don't do something, we could have a cliff come January, and the amount of stimulus that would take for then President Biden to come forward would be exponentially greater. So I think there's an awful lot of bipartisan interest. It may take those of us, bipartisan in the Senate to do that. I think sometimes our four-corner leadership, seems to be caught in some positions on both sides before the where they were before the election. I think there needs to be a real sense of urgency and good faith effort. I would start with what Secretary Mnuchin proposed right before the election as a starting point. Let's start with where he left off and see if we could come together on something. And I think it would get, if we can get to a package, I think it would get an overwhelming number of votes.
Well, let's thank Senator Warner and Senator Cornyn. That will require bipartisanship, and you two have demonstrated that bipartisanship with the Senate India caucus. And I maybe make the pivot into the kind of U.S. India relations. And Senator Cornyn, you've been co-chair since 2004. Are you surprised at how bipartisan, really nonpartisan, this relationship with India has been? There's a lot of factors here, the diaspora, et cetera, but in many ways, I assume this has exceeded people's expectations.
That's not hard to do around here, to exceed people's expectations, because they're so low. But as you know, Rich, we have a large diaspora of Indian Americans in Texas, and this is really how I got involved. And of course, through the Indo-American chambers in places like Dallas, and particularly a friend of mine, a gentleman named A.K. Mago, who got me over to India with my wife. And we learned a lot, and also learned about the incredible potential of the enhanced relationship between our two countries. I agree with the comments that were made earlier that this has always been done on a bipartisan basis. And the fact of the matter is, if you want to get anything done, it has to be bipartisan. But I remember the U.S. India Civil Nuclear Agreement, which took a long time to move forward. Since we're both democracies and not dictatorships or autocracies. But I also, through the years, have enjoyed working with people like Hillary Clinton, Chris Dodd, and now my friend Mark Warner. Mark and I share another common interest. We're both on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. So while we haven't mentioned China a lot, China looms large in our geopolitics, and both in terms of our security and economic future. And we're certainly, as Mark mentioned, the Huawei issue, concerned about the way China operates, because it doesn't play by the rules like India does. To me, that's one of the great strengths of the U.S.-India relationship, is the Anglo heritage, jurisprudential heritage of both of our countries, and observing the rule of law, playing by the rules, which I think gives greater predictability and confidence to job creators and investors, and I think is one reason why we are continuing to grow closer and closer together.
Yeah, thank you. Senator Warner, maybe just build on what Senator Cornyn said and draw upon your vice chairmanship of the Intelligence Committee. And the Senator mentioned the tensions with China as potentially something that continues on. Where do you see us on U.S.-China, and obviously our relationship with India plays a big factor there?
Well, let me again echo what John said a little bit. The Indian Americans have grown by 150% since 2000, between 2000 and 2018, 130,000 plus Indian Americans in Virginia. And like John, I started with both a number of Indian American friends. I had a number of Indian American business partners when I was in the venture capital business. And I'm very proud of the fact I was the first, I think, governor in the country to go to India back in 2004 or 5. Everybody was going to China, but I thought the opportunity was India. And we are proud that I think because of the diaspora, but also because I think India, starting with the Civ Nuke deal, has been the Indian government's, Modi and the previous governors as well, were all forward leaning into being engaged in American politics. And I think we have seen in China the rise of what I call authoritarian capitalism, where, and let me be clear, when I point out my challenge with China, it's not anti-Chinese, it's not anti-Chinese American or Chinese people. Our beef is with the Communist Party of China and Xi Jinping. But I think what we've seen is China has this model where they allowed ferocious domestic competition until a national champion arises, a la Huawei. That national champion then gets 75% of the Chinese domestic market. And that translates into 20% of the global market. And then the Chinese government will back that national champion with, in the case of Huawei, $100 billion. There is no American or Indian company alone that can compete with that. And I think what I've seen is a growing consensus, both from Indian government representatives and particularly from Indian Americans. There was a while, maybe a decade ago, where India wanted to kind of skirt not being on the China side or on the American side. But I think, echoing what Senator Cornyn said, we both are nations that operate under rule of law. China does not. Chinese companies, at the end of the day, are loyal to the Communist Party, not to their shareholders. And I think I've seen increasingly from my contacts, particularly with Indian government officials, is they know they need to come down on the side of rule of law. And I think one of the real opportunities under a Biden administration will be to create this coalition of the willing amongst democracies, of which India is the largest in the world, where we can have alignment not just around traditional economic issues, but around technology issues. And John and I have, whether it's 5G, whether it's semiconductors, a host of other areas. And the Intelligence Committee has really become almost a de facto technology committee in the Senate. We have no technology committee, but we'll try to continue to lead that. And we see great opportunities to partner with India.
That's great. Senator Warner, you may have seen that Prime Minister Modi had a good call with President-elect Biden, and they talked exactly about building out the strategic partnership. But they also talked about vaccine development, COVID, and climate change. And I wonder, maybe just ask both of you, we're obviously focused on the vaccine here and getting it out here, but in order for this to be successful, this really does have to be an international effort. And do you see the potential in working with India, other like-minded nations, but India and the U.S. have this health infrastructure that seems to be pretty well aligned. Do you see the potential, in fact, the necessity there?
Let me start. I think there is a necessity. I think that, in my visits to India, the life sciences industry is large and growing. I do think we're going to need to, independent of vaccines, look at the sourcing of some of the chemical compounds that go into our drug supply. We have much too much of that located in China now, and I think both India and the United States needs to rethink that supply chain. I think the United States should rejoin some of these international efforts. I know there was an $8 billion effort led by the EU on vaccine distribution. I think we need to rejoin that. The vaccination news is very positive. I hear some of these efficacy notions. Pfizer's kind of bumped theirs back up now to 95%, echoing what Moderna's got. But as you pointed out, Rich, unless we have an international distribution system, even if we vaccinate people in North America, we live in a global society, and we've got to find a way to partner with the billion-plus people in India. So I think this is a great area of opportunity.
Rich, if I could just add, I think the COVID virus has taught us a lot of lessons, some of which have been very painful, but to sort of underline what Mark talked about is the vulnerability of our supply chains. that's part of what got me interested in the semiconductor issue, and I know Mark shares that same concern in terms of our national security as well as our economic competitiveness. But I think we just have to change our business model to adapt to what China has done. They, as Mark pointed out, put huge amounts of money to try to be the winner in various technology races, and obviously if they could get Huawei telecom products installed around the world, they basically don't recognize a difference between the civilian government and the military. In fact, by law, anything in the so-called private sector in China has to be shared with the government and the Communist Party and the military. So that's a rising, that's a big concern. I would just say on the energy front, this has been a successful partnership for a while because of U.S. Oil and gas, principally liquefied natural gas production. We've been able to export more and more LNG around the world, including to India. I remember talking years ago to the Consul General in Houston about that, and they were eager to get some alternative energy supplies. And while we all understand that our energy mix is always going to be in transition, we're not going to get away from fossil fuels anytime soon. But that's not to suggest we shouldn't continue to try to innovate and adapt to cleaner energy outcomes. And I think the best way to do that personally is not through more government mandates and taxes and regulation necessarily, but encouraging more research and development and innovation. That's how we've always kept ahead of these problems or solve our problems, is through innovation.
Yeah,
and I think that's the way to go.
The energy partnership has been a new area of cooperation, and Senator Warner, with President-elect Biden's commitment to rejoin Paris and India being now having the highest renewable targets in the world, this also seems like another area of great cooperation, in addition to what Senator Cornyn said, building upon that, but trying to partner with India on a renewable future as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, there are ways, both in terms of this joint partnership, but there are also things, and this, John and I have not talked about this yet, but there may be ways to get at this problem from the private sector that I don't think that have been fully explored. I mean, lots and lots of corporate America wants to move forward on issues like resiliency. If we made that a material item that public companies needed to report on, I think you would see, maybe short of a regulatory environment, shareholders demanding that kind of movement towards a cleaner economy, or towards cleaner energy. Making that material on a reporting item could be enormously significant. I want to go back though and mention one of the things that Senator Cornyn just mentioned and echo it again. And I think for a long time, we've thought private sector alone around R&D, and I agree with him on more basic research and development innovation. But I do think that the challenge we face with China, and we see it not only in 5G, but increasingly we're going to see it in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, facial recognition, a host of new areas, is going to require two actions from this alliance of the willing. One is that we all get re-involved, U.S., India, other democracies, in the standards, protocols, and rules setting. And I think our values around rule of law, transparency, human rights can be reflected in those standards. I think we all kind of fell asleep at the switch. This kind of gets a little techie, but fell asleep at the switch and allowed China to start dominate setting standards. And he or she who sets the standards oftentimes can rule the field. And then secondly, I think if you embrace this idea of this authoritarian capitalism where China backs its national champions, I think, and it won't just be America, it could be America, India, could be Five Eye partners, European partners, but I would also add Singapore, South Korea, Japan. We're going to need as governments to make some of the level of investments, the way John and I have suggested on semiconductors. I think we're going to need to do in 5G and in elsewise. We don't want to pick winners and losers, but we can't walk away from what used to be called industrial policy when we see, very sophisticated 21st century industrial policy coming out of China. And I think this is, again, an area where India and the United States, at least in my conversations with Indian officials, I think they understand both the challenge and also the opportunity. But we've got to get to this goes back to the standards piece. We've got to work with countries like India on technology so that we don't default to a data localization issue in India and a separate system in America. We've got to have that coalition of the willing amongst democracies.
That's a great point. I know we've got about 8 minutes to go and a few topics yet to cover, so we'll try to go in a speed round here. Senator Cornyn, I wanted to ask you about the U.S.-India defense relationship. And, India has been designated a major defense partner of the United States, and Congress played a role in that. But I just wonder, where can we take the U.S.-India defense relationship? You've worked on this a lot. Where do you see this headed in terms of either defense or intelligence sharing, homeland defense?
Well, I was talking to Ambassador Sandhu about this yesterday, and one of the earlier speakers mentioned the Quad. And, one of the things that America has is friends like India. China doesn't have very many friends. And I think we need to recognize the strength of that coalition building represented by the Quad and the recent military exercises that were undertaken, because it's obviously China is not going to stop until they're going to continue to threaten freedom of navigation in international sea lanes and jeopardize trade and the economy of countries like India and the world, frankly. So we're going to have to continue to support one another. Again, I think this has been an interesting transition over the last 20 years or so. You see more and more Chinese involvement in Pakistan. And obviously we're all aware of since the end of the British rule in India and the partition, there's always been a historical tension, certainly between Pakistan and India, both nuclear powers. But we need to try to do what we can to, I think, work together with our defense allies. And there's no bigger one than India. So I've been very encouraged to see the cooperation. I guess we have had a few things we've had to work our way through, like the S-400 system that India purchased from Russia. But I think those are sort of legacy problems that we're got to continue to work on to try to resolve. But I see it getting better and better all the time, and that's very encouraging to me.
Senator,
let me just quickly add, Rich. That elevation of India to kind of almost a near NATO type partner, I want to make sure USIBC friends both here and in India all realize those almost all came about because of Cornyn Warner amendments to the NDAA each year. So not to be shy politicians here, but let's give your chairs and your U.S. India caucus some credit there. And I would echo
Senator, that's a very accurate reading, and I think maybe just put it back on the caucus to say that we're really talking about building out a non-treaty kind of alignment with India, and we really will count on Congress to pull to be the glue that holds the two countries together. Senator Cornyn, you mentioned Pakistan. I maybe just mention Afghanistan very quickly. There was news of the drawdown yesterday, potentially the Taliban in a power sharing, agreement in the future, which also raises concerns. I mean, does that give you any pause about, the neighborhood that India is in is pretty challenging?
Yes, it does, is the short answer. And I've expressed my concerns, particularly about sort of the precipitous nature of the planned drawdown. Mark and I have been, in our role on the Intelligence Committee, been briefed on much of this, some of which is not public, but obviously we've got alliances like NATO, we've got bordering countries that have been part of that coalition, and we can't just give up on our role there without risking the rise of Iranian influence, which is already significant, as you know, in Afghanistan. But I think we need to continue our stabilizing presence and also our counterterrorism platforms there. I've been skeptical from the beginning about the good faith of the Taliban. I don't trust them any farther than I can throw them. But I understand the desire to bring our troops home, but we also need to have the infrastructure there to protect our other interests. And that's going to require some military presence by the United States government in cooperation with NATO and our friends.
Thank you. Can I do two quick topics, just I got 3 minutes left here. One on trade and one on immigration, both of which we could talk about for 3 hours, not 3 minutes. But India and the United States have not entered into big multilateral trade agreements. Where India didn't do RCEP, we didn't do TPP. Do you see support for a U.S. India trade package of some kind? One has been pending for a while. And secondly, on immigration, there's a lot of concern not only about tech workers, but just the fairness and welcoming of the system, the long time it takes for green card holders to become citizens, potentially ending family-based immigration. Is there a chance for immigration reform in this next Congress? So two big questions and no time to answer them.
Well, let me start.
Trade.
Well, let me start. Let me echo, first of all, what John said diplomatically. Cutting and running in Afghanistan will be a disaster. It'll be a disaster to our Afghan partners. It'll be a disaster to the stability of the Afghan government, which we paid dearly with time, treasure, and American lives. It'll be a disaster for our 30-plus partners who fought side by side with us in Afghanistan. And it should not be dictated by an exiting president's political timetable. It is a disaster. In terms of trade, I think it was also a mistake, and I think one of the great mistakes was withdrawal from TPP, and both political parties bear some blame on that. And the idea that you've just seen China announce a massive economic trade relationship with our former TPP partners, which frankly excludes India and the U.S., is a real challenge and problem, and we need to re-engage with our partners in the region. I think the trade relationship that I hope the Biden administration will pursue will be one around this idea of an alliance of the willing around technology, and I think India would be a critical component part of that. It would be different than traditional economic or military. I think there's going to be technology alliances, and India should be a lead partner in that.
Yeah, Senator Cornyn, you want to take the immigration question?
Well, I agree with what Mark said about TPP, and we'll see what happens in Georgia, but we may have a divided government here, and it's going to require us all to work together. One of the biggest disappointments of my career in the Senate has been our failure to deal with our immigration system, which is a border state, Texas. We feel that particularly acutely, but it is global in nature. And obviously we have a lot of very talented people who come to the United States to work on an H-1B visa. And I think we need to make another run at more of a merit-based immigration system. I'm not suggesting eliminating family-based visa or immigration, but need to rebalance that in a way that allows us to continue to compete with the rest of the world for the best and brightest minds and the people who I think would do nothing but help us grow our economy and make America stronger.
Yeah.
And Rich, could I just add one quick thing here?
Sure.
I know we're running out of time, and I think this is important for our friends who are watching in America, but also our friends who are watching in India. John Cornyn and I are of different political parties. We don't have identically the same political views, but I hope you've heard today, dissuading some of the media view. We are friends. There are a whole lot of things we work together on, and this idea that the whole Senate is this totally partisan, dysfunctional entity. I think John and I and a whole lot of other of us in this body would like to dissuade people of that view. And as I think this conversation has shown, there's an awful lot we have in common.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a great place to wrap up on a very hopeful and note of bipartisanship. And again, thank you both for your leadership. not only on U.S. India, but on a whole range of issues. And it's great that you could join us here today. So I also want to thank USIBC and Nisha and Prakash and the whole team, and both of you, Senators Cornyn and Warner. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Good morning and good evening to our friends in India. I'm looking forward to moderating today's panel discussion on navigating COVID and climate change in the U.S.-India partnership, particularly from the lens of an incoming Biden administration. We've all seen that climate change and COVID-19 have presented profound and unforeseen challenges to the global order. We're all by now familiar with the serious, irreversible impacts of climate change. The intensity of natural disasters is increasing. Sea levels are expected to rise, all while potentially producing millions of climate refugees. The US and India are two of the world's 3 largest emitters of greenhouse gases, and both will continue to have intense and growing energy needs. President-elect Biden has called the climate crisis the greatest challenge facing the US and the world. And then there's COVID. With the recent surge in cases, we've seen more than 55 million cases and 1.3 million deaths globally, more than 11 million cases in the US alone, and nearly 9 million cases in India. And the economic impact has been grim, with major contractions to most economies, spikes in unemployment, and the end of the pandemic still not clear. So with all of these challenges, I want to also bring our two panelists on board to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities. And I'm excited to introduce Dr. Mehul Mehta and Amos Hochstein as our two panelists today for this discussion. Dr. Mehta serves as the Chief Medical Officer at Albright Stonebridge Group and leads the firm's health practice. Prior to joining Albright Stonebridge Group, Dr. Mehta held leadership positions at Harvard Medical International and at Partners Healthcare International, and also served as a senior fellow at the Harvard Global Health Institute, where he led initiatives on technology and health. Dr. Mehta also serves on the board of trustees of the American Nurses Association. So Dr. Mehta basically has the resume of every Indian parent's dreams. Amos most recently served as Executive Vice President of Marketing at Tellurian and previously served as the U.S. Special Envoy for International Energy Affairs in the Obama-Biden administration, working very closely with Vice President Biden. As the U.S. energy diplomat, Amos oversaw global U.S. energy foreign policy engagement and advised the Secretary of State and the Vice President on global energy markets. Dr. Mehta and Amos, thank you both for joining the panel today. And I'd like to kick it off by allowing you both to provide a few opening remarks. So Dr. Mehta, I'll start with you. You've been building bridges in the healthcare space between the US and India for the majority of your career. Can you share a little bit of your learnings with the group today?
Well, thank you for having me, Safia, and thank USIBC. I think this is an extremely important time with COVID. The crisis is unprecedented. Both countries have been really hammered by this crisis. In many ways, it's similar. Large democracies, heterogeneous populations, large number of cases, a great amount of regional management of this condition. And I think this forms the basis of really looking at a new way of coming together around, if you take the spectrum of COVID, around the core elements that you can tackle COVID on, because both countries stand to benefit. And that starts with climate change. That starts with how this pandemic originated, the whole zoonotic jump across to humans, which we are only going to see more of. Really building bridges around that. The second area is really shoring up the surveillance, the ability to pick these things up early. And this is a global issue. It's a multilateral issue, but India in particular has the ability to strengthen its surveillance systems with US inputs, especially around genomics. Big issue. The third is around the whole area of response. India's capacity to build at scale, at low cost, therapeutics, especially in the area of anti-infectives, which is what we're going to see in the future. The advent of new drug-resistant bugs. We haven't invested in that area. India forms a unique partner. And then the fourth is the whole system strengthening and system response of the healthcare delivery system. India is strengthening its system. India would welcome US inputs, US knowledge. US can benefit from many of the health systems that have been able to deliver healthcare at scale, cost effectively. We have disparities of care. We can learn from that. So I think the COVID pandemic convergence of interests forms the basis of what I think is an opportunity for a healthcare life science partnership in many unique ways that opens up funding, that opens up investments, that opens up new ways of regulating and speeding things up. And India then can have a regional influence. So I think this is a very unique point, and I hope we can capitalize on this.
Thank you. And we'll turn back to that, but I do want to ask Amos for your reflections and opening remarks, and particularly from your time advising then Vice President Biden, now President-elect Biden, on energy and climate. And what do you see as the priorities for the U.S.-India relationship on energy and climate?
Good morning, good evening, and thank you, Sophia, for having me, and thank you to Nisha and the team at the U.S. India Business Council for hosting this event today and for inviting me to speak. I think that, as you said earlier today, this morning at this panel, the United States and India are two of the three largest emitters. We are also two of the largest economies in the world, and we are both growing economies that will continue to grow into the future, and our energy intensive intensity of our economic growth will also continue to grow. So when we look at the arc of where we are today on climate change and the battle towards climate change, the United States played a leading role for many years, and especially when in the Paris Accords, and we have abandoned that leadership in the world today. India joined with the United States together in partnership in the Paris Accords, and it was the United States that moved away. So we have to look at now is how do we build a new partnership between the United States and India, between the United States and the rest of the world, where first we restore trust that the United States means what it says, and that we actually want to take this leadership role and want to take action both domestically and internationally on energy and on climate, and then to see how we strengthen those individual bilateral relationships. The United States is going to return, the Biden administration, as President-elect Biden said, will return to the Paris Accords right away. So that's not in doubt. But I think what's most important is to identify how we can make this not a U.S. story or a U.S.-Europe story on investment technology, but rather a partnership with other large economies such as India, where we can focus on ensuring that there is the right financing, that there is the right attention to technology that can bring about investment in the future, in a cleaner future for all of us. India is a natural place for the United States to focus on this. When I was in the previous position with the Obama administration, we had a mechanism between the United States and India to identify financing mechanism for renewable energy. That has not progressed over the last several years, and I would imagine that this is going to be a major area of cooperation between the U.S. and India to identify how we can use technological innovation in India and in the United States, but bring international financing and American investment in India and with India so that we can deploy technologies faster throughout an economy that a population is significantly larger than the United States. And we could recognize through that we can't do this alone. We need the help of India in order to make sure that this is a truly global effort. As President-elect Biden said earlier, this is the greatest challenge that we face today. And the reason that it's the greatest challenge is because it's one that it's out of our control. It's not one that we can affect on our own. And the challenge of that is, how do you create an international response that recognizes the differences and the different challenges that different countries and different regions face? This is not a one-size-fits-all approach in order to combat climate change. And that's why, as we recognize the challenges that India faces are different than the ones that the United States does, we will have to work together. But let me add that this is not just about climate change and energy. The United States and India need to think through and forge a new partnership as we move forward in the Biden administration that looks at the broader world and the region and our neighborhoods, and understand that the security challenges, not just climate, but the security challenges, the cyber challenges, the technology challenges that we all face, we face them together. And the US needs India as a partner. We need to work together and forge this new strategic alliance between the United States and India to confront the rise of China, the ambitions of China, and other threats that we all face together. Climate has to be a centerpiece of that, but it can't be the only area. This requires a brand new US-India strategic alliance that will be able to confront together the challenges that the United States faces in the region and the challenges that India will face as well. So I think we are at an exciting time at the beginning of the Biden administration in really creating a new path, a new partnership between the US and India to address all of these challenges.
Thanks, thank you, Amos. And maybe I'll just add on to that a little bit. You know, I think I want to manage expectations a little bit, because I feel like I've been hearing from many friends that there's this expectation once the new administration comes in, there's going to be this bounce back to an immediate fixing of all of these problems. We talked about how the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Paris Accord and the impact of that globally. But what do you see specifically, Amos, as the initial steps that the Biden administration is going to take to tackle climate change, and sort of what do you see as, you know, the next 6 months, the first, you know, those first 100 days for the Biden administration, specifically on climate, and what role does India play in that?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I don't speak for the Biden transition or for the Biden incoming Biden administration, so I'll let them speak for themselves. But here are some of the things that I believe will happen right away. The first thing is, as I said before, the rejoining of the Paris Agreement. So that will happen right away, and that is a strong signal. But you're right. You don't get to play in global leadership in politics. You don't just erase 4 years and just say, let's just pick things where we left off in 2016. That's just not how the world works. So we have to take some significant actions. The first, I think, beyond joining the Paris Accords, is to re-implement and reintroduce some of the regulations in the United States on clean energy and on regulating emissions. We have to show the United States and the world that we mean business, that we're serious about ourselves. We have to make the cost of fossil fuels a little bit more expensive here at home by making the cost of carbon higher. I would presume that the United States will seek, the Biden administration, President-elect Biden will seek to convene a meeting of global leaders of the largest economies in the world, including India, that will try to address some goals that we should both share as to how do we set a timeline and a timetable for reducing emissions globally. Third, I think we will have to look at the question of finance. How does the United States, together with India, identify financial tools and instruments that will allow deployment of technology, of renewable energy, of clean tech in other countries? And that's where we will have to figure out, what does this mean in Europe, and what does this mean in a country like India, where the growth of coal-based energy is still growing. And we need to figure out, together with the government of India, what would it take, because the goals of Prime Minister Modi are strong. The views that he has articulated recently in the policy plans are very good. How do you get there? And we had a goal that was articulated in 2015 by Prime Minister Modi of 175 gigawatts of renewable energy, of solar and wind. We now need that next set of goals, and how do we reduce the growth of coal, and how do we bring prices down and allow international investment to grow and flourish in India? These are really hard issues to tackle, and they're going to take different measures. What is the role of natural gas? What is the role of how do we bring about a faster transition from fossil to renewable, to clean, to electric vehicles, to greening the grid? These are all areas that the United States and India are going to have to work on together, but the United States is going to have to recognize the uniqueness and the differences in the Indian economy and the Indian job market. And I'll end with, this is where COVID and energy come together. We have to recognize that COVID has wrecked national budgets in India, in the United States, in other places. Not everyone is going to be in the same position to finance and subsidize and afford the incentives for the green economy that we need to bring about. And that's why the global economy is going to have to work together in order to support that and replace that.
Thanks, Amos. And with that, I'll segue and turn to Dr. Mehta. So what do you see as the greatest impacts on the U.S.-India relationship, specifically maybe as it impacts supply chains, U.S.-India cooperations on technology, and as it pertains to vaccines? So recently, we've seen the promising news from Pfizer and Moderna on the effectiveness of their new COVID vaccines. And we know India is oftentimes called the pharmacy to the world. What does this U.S.-India collaboration in pharma and tech look like? And can you share a little bit on that and sort of how India is positioned in this?
Sure. So I think if you look at what is the immediate need that we're going to hit is really getting vaccines out at scale and distributing them. Just having a vaccine available doesn't mean people get vaccinated, right? So, and that is a problem the US is going to face. That's a problem India is going to face. India has the capacity, as Amos said, all budgets have been decimated, right? India has the capacity to produce at scale. It's done it in generics. It's doing it for certain types of vaccines. It's going to produce billions of units. So we have to understand that India is a natural partner when it comes to scaling up the technology, the science that's developed to manage this pandemic, either from a therapeutic platform or from a vaccination platform. And that means really, I would think bilateral agreements or partnerships around production for therapeutics for this current pandemic forms the basis of a much larger relationship around the whole area of infectious diseases, which is, I believe, what we are going to see much more of. That's the area we are entering into. So that's one natural area and technology flows with that. Technology is the whole area of looking at where the outcomes are going to happen, how you're measuring them. India has a very strong IT base, leveraging those low-cost technologies with high impact that we can use here, that India can scale, that the region can benefit from. India is going to be the pharmacy for the vaccines for many parts of sub-Saharan Africa too. So I think that's one area. The other is to understand that all vaccines are not the same. And we talk about Pfizer, we talk about Moderna, these are all mRNA technologies. There's a whole infrastructure required to distribute these vaccines because they go at cold chains. Now, to have that infrastructure in the US is going to be a challenge. To have it in India is even a bigger challenge. So how do you build this infrastructure in a way that you sort of take learnings across, that there are ways in which maybe the science can be improved to not require this at this level? Maybe there are different ways of distributing this kind of vaccine, looking at the other vaccines, the adenoviral vector vaccines, which require a different distribution chain, and whether there's applicability here. So I think there's a lot to unpack extremely soon. It's going to hit us in our face. Neither country is fully ready to distribute these vaccines. And until we get them out and vaccinate a large cohort of people, the pandemic's curve is not going to bend. And that is the immediate need where I see collaborations need to occur, and technology and science and production needs to converge.
When you talk about science and technology, we oftentimes hear that India doesn't have the cold chain technology that needed in a range of innovative spaces. How are they going to manage? How is India going to manage the vaccine and the needs for this type of technology, or do you see differentiations in the market?
So I think that two things that will probably happen. One is that the science itself, or the need for minus 70 or 80 degree cold chain versus tweaking the science, and already you've seen Moderna saying they probably can have refrigeration up to 30 days. and other people who are behind the curve in coming out, talking about you don't need that cold chain, that level of cold chain. I think first is a science, because this is a challenge across all countries. And if you have to scale this to the world and vaccinate the world, this is a big limitation. By the way, I don't know if distribution accounts for 3/4 of vaccination costs. So you have to tackle distribution. This is where expertise in logistics and distribution of biologics come into play. And I think that's where technology and low-cost solutions that actually can work help. And we tend often to think of the most sophisticated technological heavy solutions. India has the natural ability to think of technologically light, low-cost solutions. They do it in healthcare delivery, they do it in manufacturing. I think this is where these things have to come together. So India will probably have to make choices if it can't build to switch out of an mRNA vaccine unless the science moves in that direction, and look at vaccines that you can deliver in just, dry ice or refrigeration. And that's the choices that we'll have to face. And, how do you adjudicate these choices? That's what's going to be important.
Thank you. Thank you. So Amos, let me turn back to you and ask you about renewable energy, and which is a stated priority for the Modi government. It's a stated priority for the Biden administration. What opportunities and challenges do you see in this space for U.S.-India cooperation in the renewable space, specifically as we're trying to promote U.S. investment opportunities in that sector?
Well, I think that, I'd like to, something that Dr. Mehta said, where one of the advantages of India, as he discussed in regard to the scaling of in the pharmaceutical side, on the health side, is the same in many other sectors, including in energy. And as we develop more, new technology is always going to be a little bit more expensive. And what brings down the cost is the scaling and the ability to manufacture at scale and at lower cost. And there is no reason in my mind why what has happened in China can't happen in India, which is to begin the manufacturing and the production at much larger scales, both for India and around the world, coming out of India. So I think that as we partner and look for ways to scale renewable energy technology, green tech technology, clean air technology, clean water technology, these are all going to be areas that I think are going to require both the scale that India has, the ability to manufacture at lower cost, and ultimately the logistic ability to have infrastructure implemented and built out and so on. This requires some regulatory changes. This requires some legal changes and a mindset shift in both the United States and India. So I think that there is an area for cooperation here between us in identifying where we go. One of the challenges that we're going to see is that the Indian economy, as I said before, is still expected. The energy sector is still expected to have coal-based power grow into the future, and that's going to be a challenge, because that will hurt the ability of India to reduce emissions, to clean air. And of course, the obvious connection between the energy sector and the health sector, the cleaner the air, the lower the costs are on health. We have a lot of health challenges beyond COVID, sure. and clean air or the pollution, rising pollution, contributes billions of dollars of cost to governments, to state governments, local governments, hospitals, healthcare, in all these areas. So this is not just about climate change, as in trying to change the trajectory of increasing temperature, but also clean air, cleaning the air that we breathe, and to make sure that we are protecting ourselves. So challenge number one is the increase of coal. Challenge number two is the ability to attract finance into this sector in India. And I think this is where when we figure out what the right path is for different parts of the world, and we come together on this, we have to think about what is doable for India, and how do we in the United States, not just as the US, but as we sit together on international organizations, financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the IFC, and how do we bring about a change of focus and attention to the flow of investment dollars and securing those dollars, and what what can India do domestically to help attract that kind of investment. We are going to if we don't tackle this issue of finance and investment into countries such as India, especially, and we don't support India in this effort, then we are not going to win the war on climate change. It's just not going to work, and that's been evidenced over the last several years. So we have to have a different mindset in the United States. We have to work together. I was very encouraged that this topic was exactly discussed between Prime Minister Modi and President-elect Biden, according to the readout in their first phone conversation yesterday. So I think that's going to be the area. But how do we make sure that a move towards a cleaner, more renewable economy in India is not required, doesn't require the kind of financial sacrifices in labor market. Quite the contrary. How does it create a boom in the economy and a new job growth in a new sector so that transition could be more? Because I think it'll be difficult to do that if it requires these financial sacrifices.
So my next question is to both of you, Dr. Mehta and Amos, and it's really about how the pandemic has brought about a number of major changes, including major disruptions to supply chains, logistics networks, energy supplies, and considering the risks from long-term climate change, but also the shorter-term impact of pandemics and future pandemics. I mean, we can't just look at COVID right now. We have to look at potential, future threats. How should the health sector and the energy sector position itself to protect itself and better address these threats in the future? I mean, I feel like the world was sort of caught flat-footed in many ways, and how do we address that going forward?
So let me start, because I think I see it as a dichotomy that should not be there. It is one health, right? They're inextricably linked. Energy and the consequences of choices you make in energy have a direct impact on health. I want to amplify a couple of things Amos said. If you look at clean air and the mortality rates and the severity of COVID are directly linked, okay, because it's a respiratory disease to start out with. If you look at the impact of choices and deforestation and pandemic surges, that's linked to healthcare. So the issue of climate change and health is an area that needs to be completely understood. It has to be explored. There's data is coming out, but again, it's really early data. We should not see these two things as separate. I see it as one continuum of origination of disease and manifestation on societies and populations. It has completely forced us to rethink how we look at all aspects of healthcare in its entirety. And that includes the convergence from, or the crossover from climate change. Our care delivery models have to be rethought through, because we have looked at this false dichotomy between private care and acute care and public health. It's again one spectrum of care. We've seen all private beds became public beds. We've seen ways in which technology had to be redeployed and rethought of. We've seen supply chains that had to be reconfigured from textiles to PPE. Well, since we've gone through that pain, let's build on that and really look at how can we reconfigure the whole environment to ways that will actually be much more efficient for other diseases. It's not that other diseases just went away. We have a brewing pandemic in mental health. We have an issue in other diseases that were treated late. So I think this discussion is forcing a rethink of the entire way of how we looked at things and what is the new paradigm. And I would absolutely include climate change as a key component of that discussion, at least from the healthcare side.
I think to continue that chain, we have to look. I won't repeat the point that healthcare and climate change are so linked, not just in COVID, right? I mean, we can see the levels of asthma and other respiratory diseases that are not COVID that we have been monitoring the effects of pollution. And by the way, it's not just climate. I mean, we still have burning crops and other areas that have contributed to pollution throughout South Asia and Southeast Asia that can be addressed as well. But I think there's another area, and Dr. Mehta just talked about looking at supply chains in a different way and how do we decentralize and enable us to deliver therapeutics and vaccines throughout the country, especially ones that require so much refrigeration, which of course in turn require a lot of energy and power in order to achieve these kinds of effective refrigeration that have not just affordable power, but consistent and reliable sources of power throughout the country. But I think what this also means is that we have to look at, we can't look at India in the climate change lens in the same way that we look at Europe, the United States, South America. It has to be, there has to be a difference there. And there's been a lot of infrastructure that's been built out by the government in the natural gas side of things over the last many months and years, and that's commendable in order to have that transition from coal to gas. But we have to start looking at in the grid into some new technologies that decentralizes. So distributed renewable energy and microgrids to enable states and localities to have a power system that does not require its interconnection constantly to its neighboring states, neighboring towns and cities, but rather having deploying the newer technologies to enable this distributed renewable energy. That will in turn support the supply chains for many other things, including the response to COVID and other diseases that come to enable to have an ability for local governments at the most local level to address these issues and have the ability to have reliable and affordable power that will then in turn help the agricultural sector, the water sector, food, industrial, and of course, what we're talking about today, the health sector. So these are all areas that we are going to be, that are differences between the United States and India, but ones where technology is moving in that direction. And we have to think through how do we create coalitions around the world and among institutions, health institutions, energy institutions, technology institutes, universities, to bring about these kind of changes to make them tailor fit for the Indian market, Indian economy. Ultimately, I strongly believe that this will also become a jobs program, because I think as we transition in this area, both on health and on energy, we are going to be creating a new job economy in these sectors that will help the transition even further.
Thank you. And maybe I can ask you both a question also, which may be more focused for Dr. Mehta, but I'd love your thoughts on this also, Amos, is, we're seeing rising numbers of COVID cases, both in the US and in India, but globally. And we're going into the colder season. We're going into the holiday season. We've just celebrated Diwali. We're going into Thanksgiving, and many of us want to be with our families and travel and celebrate. And we're facing lockdowns globally here in the US and all around the world. So we're seeing these rising numbers of COVID cases around the world. We're seeing the Biden administration work with states to slow the spread. In India, we've seen lockdowns, and we've also on the flip side of that seen the economic impact of these lockdowns. But so first to you, Dr. Mehta, is what sort of public health measures do you recommend, and what do you see as effective for implementing effective strategies in the U.S. and in India? But also, the question that I've had on my mind is initially when the pandemic hit, there was great fear for countries like India, which are densely populated, or continents and countries like Africa, in Africa, where we would see a massive public health crisis, and we haven't seen that to scale. And I'm knocking on wood right now, but we just haven't seen the sort of crises that could have been, right? So if you could kind of reflect on that, and then Amos, if you can kind of talk a little bit about the Biden administration. I know you're not on the transition team, and you're not speaking on behalf of the campaign, but I do want to get your thoughts, having worked with Vice President Biden, now President-elect Biden, just sort of what his thinking might be and how he's planning on implementing his sort of day one strategy to combat COVID. So first you, Dr. Mehta.
Sure. So I think there were two components to your question. One is, what are the public health measures to today, as we see the surge happening, what they're calling the third surge, but I think the surge has never really stopped. It's just slowed down and come back. So let me just step back and answer that question. Nothing has fundamentally changed in terms of the science of public health containment of COVID between when it started to now. Till we have therapeutics that are effective, and we see a lot coming down the pipe, especially in monoclonals, and we see vaccines that can prophylax against COVID, and that is also how long that occurs. We'll have to see. The foundational public health measures stay the same. And what are they? This is primarily an airborne virus that spreads from person to person. And it is really protecting yourself from this airborne spread. And that means the further you are, the less the chance of spread. If you're outdoors, obviously the less the chance of spread, because there's airflow and there's cross ventilation. And if you protect the ports of entry, and what are the ports of entry? Ports of entry are the nose and the mouth and the eyes. So therefore, you see this need for masking and need for a right masking in the right manner to prevent the port of entry. It helps you, it helps the people around you, because if somebody is a spreader, then it actually prevents or reduces the chance, or the what we call the viral load of spread. So none of these have really changed. And if we have to contain it, we have to actually come back to these proved scientific measures that you have heard time and again Dr. Fauci talk about and health experts talk about. And it is that part of this is, hand washing, but it's really about clean air. It comes down to clean air and keeping the spaces that air spaces that you are in, safe. So I think instituting that by itself has shown that you can actually reduce the spread. And based on that, what form of targeted lockdown you need versus a widespread lockdown, or what I would call targeted containment strategies, you can play out. The virus just, it's not widely known. It has an asymmetric spread. Few people are infecting the rest. And this sort of asymmetric spread, what is called a K parameter in public health, is unique to this virus. It's a virus that that's how you pick up hotspots and you shut them down. It's the same public health measures. Your second question was in the context of, can you just repeat the second question? You had two parts, right?
Yeah, my second question was about sort of the impact of the spread and how we've sort of seen projections of how in countries like India. Right.
Right. So your question was, in India, why don't we see the same mortality? It's a question of mortality, right? Infection rates are high.
Right.
Why don't you see the same mortality? So answers to these questions are complex, but at a very simple level, it seems to be the biology of the virus and the immune status of populations, the way it impacts. It's a dance between the infection and the immune status, and how populations that have been exposed to multiple diseases and who have, let's say, a high level of BCG prophylaxis. That's a very strong hypothesis that still studies have to show, seem to have intrinsic immunity or immune responses that are stronger, that prevent them from getting into severe disease. Well, and there are two parts of the immune system, without going into technical details. And the fact is that they have got exposed to other diseases or other forms of this virus. Remember, this is a seventh coronavirus. So other forms of this virus, in terms of a cold coronavirus, that got them exposed, the system recognizes it, the system mounts a fast response. So that's one set of hypotheses. The second set of hypotheses is that these are younger populations, and these younger populations are therefore not seeing the extent of disease as you're seeing in environments with older populations. And that the fact that we have been able to, and I wouldn't underestimate that there have been places in India that have taken really good containment steps, not high tech, but really good containment steps, disciplined containment steps. The state of Kerala, how they actually contained the whole pandemic in the slums in Dharavi in Bombay. These are all important exemplars to really learn from. So it's multifaceted, but that's probably why we are seeing low mortality but high infection rates in countries like India and even sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you. Amos, if you could talk a little bit about the domestic situation here. I don't know. I know you're sort of here to talk about the energy and climate change, but I do want to get your thoughts because, we saw Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, his first task was setting up the COVID task force, and he's been meeting regularly with the COVID task force. And there's been this push and pull between the impact on the economy here domestically and the shutdowns and the impact of that versus the need for what the public health crisis is what it's calling for, which is for us to stay home and to be safe. So, and to mask. And so I would just love your thoughts on that, Amos.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, look, I think that we're seeing in the country over the last 9 months a clear difference of philosophy and approach to a public health crisis. And what President-elect Biden has said from the beginning is, yes, you are correct. This will take a toll on the economy. This will have a really a terrible impact on a lot of small businesses in particular. But we have to address this pandemic. We have to address this as a global health crisis to protect our own people. I think that the Joe Biden that I know, believes that job number one of the President of the United States is to protect the people of the United States. Now, traditionally, we see that role as protecting it from enemies, foreign and domestic. That is usually terrorism, war, etc. This is the terrorism of our time. This is the enemy that the people of the United States are facing today. And job number one of the president is to protect the American people. And that means that you have to do more than one thing at a time. We have to have, I'm not a health expert, so I don't know if it's lockdowns or not, and it seems like they're leaning towards more targeted measures. But the idea is coming up with a national strategy that addresses it, requiring the wearing masks, people who don't need to go out shouldn't, and protecting at-risk populations. That is what I believe Joe Biden sees as his most sacred and his obligation towards the American public once he becomes president. And so I believe strongly that that's what he's going to do. Having said that, we do need to address the economy. We cannot allow people to say, I'm trying to keep you safe and healthy, but I'm taking away your income. And that's why the stimulus has been there. Some of these packages to increase funding for people who are suffering through this. And that's something that we have to take care of and ensure that that small businesses are taken care of, that large businesses don't have massive layoffs. But I think part of it is understanding that no matter what I do domestically, if I only look at it as a US problem, it's a pandemic. That is not going to work. And therefore, if anything that we know about Joe Biden from the last several decades of his in public service is seeing the world as one place. Especially when we talk about things like infectious diseases from around the world, we can't just look at home. We have to work together. We have to rejoin the WHO, where India plays such a critical role right now. And we have to have a global approach. So yes, domestic approaches coupled with an international approach. You can't constantly save or solve the issue in one place and make sure that it then comes back from elsewhere into your country. So I think that's how he will view this. That's how he's going to view the healthcare crisis. But I think it's a good roadmap to how he's going to view cyber, how he's going to view threat of dictatorship and decline of democracy in certain places, how he's going to view the fight on climate change and clean air. These are all areas, and migration, which is this is part of the climate change, but not only the national security threats around the world. How do we address the rise of authoritarian and illiberal democracies, as Mr. Orban liked to say? These are all the same kind of approach. We have to protect the American people. We have to protect American jobs. We have to create an economy, but doing it alone doesn't work in any of these areas. We have to rejoin international infrastructures, and we have to create new ones that will allow us to have strong partnerships. So we stand up to democracy, to freedom, to health, to climate, to cyber, and so on. These are all areas that we have to do this in parallel tracks at home and lead the way internationally in not leading other countries, but leading in partnership with other countries and recognizing the needs and unique status of other countries.
Thanks, Amos. And we have about 2 minutes left in the conversation, so I do want to wrap up. But my last question to both of you is really sort of, Dr. Mehta, you have immense experience in the healthcare space, and sort of what are the lessons learned here from this pandemic, and what can we be doing better in terms of sharing information, and whether it's technology, whether it's we were talking yesterday about hospital administration and nurses, and how we're sort of sharing information between countries, and what are your lessons learned for the next administration as they're looked at to sort of come in January, and what would your advice be? And then similarly, almost to you in the energy and climate space, in terms of the U.S. India partnership, what are your lessons learned, and what's the advice going forward for this next administration? So to you, Dr. Mehta.
Well, I think the biggest lesson is that, we are all in this together, as Amos said, and health security is national security. And the same attention that you pay to national security, you have to pay to health security. And this is not going to be solved unilaterally. And India forms, because this is an India context, a very critical partnership to solve this. Because in the absence of having a healthy population, there is no economy to talk about. And in the presence of fear of something coming and making people sick, everything falls apart. So all the steps we need to take to do this have to occur, and the pressure is that it has to occur now, because we are in the midst of this. So to me, that's the biggest takeaway, is that we have to get our blinkers off and the isolationist mindset out.
Amos.
Yeah, I think that again, as I just said, I think in the energy and climate space, as we have in other spaces, what Dr. Mehta just said, climate change is not something the United States is going to solve by itself. It has to take difficult and strong steps that I think that President-elect Biden has articulated. And that doesn't mean necessarily radical shifts on day one, but a radical change of thought and perspective. And as we incentivize the American public to move towards, as a consumer and as a taxpayer, to move towards renewable energy, to move towards cleaner technology, cleaner automobiles, et cetera, we will have to do that together with the rest of the world. So joining Paris doesn't change anything except on the ground. What it changes is this radical mind shift change, that we have to work with everybody together. And I think this is the area, as we've talked about for the last hour, that President-elect Biden has dedicated his life to, which is to think, how do I increase the strength in the American job market, the American economy? But we have to do on climate change what we've done in other international architectures on security, which is to work together. And I think part of the difficult lesson in the United States, and this is not going to be easy for President-elect Biden to tell the different parts of the American population, we can't have a one-size-fits-all to address this. This is not something that we're going to say to India or to anyone else. This is what we've done at home. Here's what you should be doing. It's exactly the same. It's recognizing what makes India tick and how the economy there works, and then work with what makes sense. But I also want to end where we started. The United States-India relationship and partnership has to take on a new focus, not just on particular issues, as Dr. Mehta talked today so articulately about the health partnership that is so ripe for strengthening, or the cooperation on climate change goals. But we have to see that we face other concerns and threats around the world, that the United States cannot do it based on its own, and it can't do it based on the partnership and alliances that it's had for most of the 20th century. India is now an indispensable, critical, strategic ally that the United States needs to work together with to address the concerns in the Indo-Pacific. And that's something that I think President-elect Biden is going to be focused on. And I know the team is going to look at these opportunities, but this is a great opportunity to strengthen the partnership, strengthen the position of the United States, strengthen the position of India in the region, and grow both of our economies while understanding the vast differences between us are not area for conflict, but area for recognizing the differences and figuring out how to partner and work around them and through them.
Thank you so much, Amos and Dr. Mehta. It's been a pleasure having you both on the panel. Thank you to Nisha and the USIBC team for facilitating today's conversation. I think it was a fantastic conversation, so thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for that wonderful conversation, Safia, Dr. Mehta, and Amos. Certainly, as we have heard from Senators Cornyn and Warner, and then in this last panel, there is so much to be done in the U.S.-India relationship. And the entire focus of the Indo-Pacific strategy in the current administration has been talking about some of these very issues. So to continue that conversation, we have with us today a very eminent person who has really been focused on the Indo-Pacific before it was even really being talked about as the Indo-Pacific. I have the privilege of welcoming to the USIBC stage a dear friend and close colleague from the Obama administration, Dr. Kurt Campbell. He's the chairman and CEO and co-founder of the Asia Group, a strategic advisory firm focused on the Asia Pacific. But, you know, Kurt doesn't really need much of an introduction to those who have been traversing the Indo-Pacific geography. I will give just a couple of highlights, though, of his illustrious accomplishments. Kurt serves, in addition to the Asia Group, Kurt serves as the chairman of the board of the Center for a New American Security. He's a non-resident fellow at the Harvard University's Belfer Center and is vice chairman of the East-West Center in Hawaii. Now, I had the pleasure of getting to know Kurt during his tenure as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs during the Obama administration, where he is widely credited as being one of the key architects of the pivot to Asia. One could say that laid the foundation for the current administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. He is the author of 10 books, including The Pivot, Future of American Statecraft in Asia, and another one titled Difficult Transitions, which might be an apt description, Kurt, of what we're experiencing today. Finally, I'm going to give one fun fact about Kurt that many of you may not know, and that is that he does a mean rendition of John Denver's Country Road, which I had the experience of enjoying on a boat cruise in the Potomac during an ASEAN senior officials meeting. Kurt, welcome to USIBC, and thank you for joining us for this important conversation today.
Yeah, thank you, Nisha. It's a real pleasure to be with you. And just to remind everyone, as we all think about Asia, we all have to have our go-to songs for various singing competitions with Asian interlocutors. I've got a few, but it's very important to be able to diversify and go from genre to genre. So thank you, and it's great to be with you today.
Well, thank you, Kurt. You know, as I was mentioning in the intro, you recognized early on the rising importance of the Indo-Pacific and particularly of India's important and role there. During the same time that India was moving from a look east policy to an act east policy, you were working to engage India in regional consultations and trilateral dialogues and engage greater coordination with India on platforms like the East Asia Summit and the Shangri-La Dialogue. Walk us through the evolution of our approach on India in the Indo-Pacific and why you think this is an important relationship for the United States.
Again, thank you very much, Nisha. It's just a pleasure to be with everyone. If you look at the Asia Pacific region, you have to acknowledge that the lion's share of the history of the 21st century is going to play out in the Asia Pacific region without question. We're going to we're going to need to step up our game substantially. As a country, we have been more focused on the Middle East and South Asia. Those were important commitments, but I think we probably overinvested over the last 20 years. Now we're going to need to step our capacities in Asia, working with allies and friends. I would argue that the key country with respect to American strategy in Asia is to develop over time a consequential, deep and multifaceted relationship between the United States and India. And I think the key here is to find common cause in the Asia-Pacific region, to ensure that we're coordinating on areas of common purpose, whether it be aligning our strategies with respect to China, working with other nations in multilateral frameworks like the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Regional Forum. These are the key tasks ahead. And I think what we've seen over the last 20 or 25 years, Nisha, you've now played a key role in it, is in improving relationship between the two sides. I believe it is generally bipartisan in the United States. I do think that there have been advances in the last several years. And I believe that the Biden administration is now poised and positioned to take the U.S.-India relationship to the next stage, even with all the difficulties on both sides and the challenging environment in the region as a whole.
So as we think about events this week, and there's been a lot of focus on trade, on economic connectivity in the Indo-Pacific. And just on Monday, 15 Asian nations led by China formed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, largest trading bloc in the world. And yet neither India nor the United States are part of it. I know that during the Obama administration, we worked hard on building the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And yet at the end of the day, we were not able to get it across the finish line, and President Trump pulled us out, preferring to focus on bilateral agreements and a more confrontational approach on trade. But what do you think should be the approach of the incoming administration on trade relationships across this very important geography? How do we really think about advancing economic connectivity with countries across the Asia Pacific?
So Nisha, it's the most important question, and you hit on the hardest issue as well. For the United States to be successful, we're going to need a multifaceted strategy. I'm confident that we're going to be able to do the rebalancing of our military capabilities in the Asia Pacific region. I'm confident we're going to be able to step up with our diplomacy. I think we will rejoin the key institutions. We will play a more active role in some of the summits and meetings that I just mentioned, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum. But the United States needs to understand that in addition to these other components, the key issue that Asians look to is that the United States has an open, optimistic, ingenious, determined approach to trade and commerce in the Asia-Pacific region. And it is not lost on these countries that right now the two dominant parties in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans, each have deep anxieties about certain aspects of trade. You're exactly right about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think RCEP, the grouping that you just described that does not include either the United States or India, that launched 2 days ago is more substantial and more important, Nisha, than we recognize. Probably deeper levels of engagement, and it creates a system of interchange and interaction that right now does not involve the United States, and that is going to hurt us over time. So in addition to everything else that we have to do, we have to address the pandemic, Nisha. We need to do what we can to heal some of the domestic divisions, which are profound. We need to have some kind of support for our economy during an absolutely critical period. In addition to all of that, we also have to come up with a trade, investment, engagement strategy in Asia that basically creates a mechanism for other countries, particularly like-minded states, to join with us. And that is a tall task and a very difficult order. I'm confident that over time that we can do this, but I believe that the demand will be there quickly. When you listen to the vice president, now the president-elect and his team, he highlights that one of the key things that we're going to need to do at the outset is listen and work with allies and partners. One of the first questions that they're going to ask is, what's your trade strategy? And I think it will be difficult for us to say we're working on it, right? Which is in fact the accurate answer. We're going to need to come up with something soon, and it's got to be comprehensive, and it's also got to be such that other countries can welcome and engage upon with us.
Kurt, you talked about the ambivalence in this country, in both parties towards trade, and it's a complicated issue in democracies. Another country that has been very deeply ambivalent on free trade has been India. And we've seen that, we've not been able to progress very far or very fast on trade talks with India. We don't have a bilateral investment treaty. We don't have a trade agreement or even a mini deal, which I think has been in discussion between the current administration and the Modi government for nearly 3 years. And yet there are very important areas for the US and India to be able to advance economic partnership, trade, and investment. None more important than perhaps the digital economy, if we are going to create a more competitive environment. What can we do in the bilateral discussions between the United States and India to create some greater convergence and harmonization on these issues? Not only in terms of how we strengthen that bilateral partnership, but also then how we collectively and individually engage the rest of that geography. Is it through a focus on trade dialogues, or is there a strategic conversation that you think could happen between these two countries that can help advance the economic partnership?
Yeah, Nisha, you're exactly right how hard it is to make the case about trade in democracies. And even though people understand sort of intrinsically the importance of trade more generally, there is a pervasive focus on the losers in trade. Some countries, particularly in Europe and Germany, have spent a considerable period of time on retraining and helping workers that are affected make transitions to new lines of work. We've not invested in those capabilities in the United States. And so there are clear losers with respect to trade and automation. We've seen that in NAFTA. We've seen that in interactions with Europe and with Asia more generally. And so there are deep concerns about the aspects of trade in which workers in key states are affected. My concern about the U.S.-India relationship, and Nisha, you put your finger on it, I think we are beginning to see a flourishing strategic set of interactions, which is of critical importance, about how we see the region as a whole. Associated with that is more coordination and cooperation on the defense side. We have Malabar ongoing. The 2+2 had a substantial discussion both about strategy and on defense-related issues. We have, thanks to a lot of the work that you and others have done, a thriving and growing people-to-people engagement. The diaspora in the United States increasingly engaged in the bilateral relationship. So those are critical components, but I think there is a recognition that that is not enough, that ultimately for the relationship to really reach escape trajectory, if you will, to really sustain itself, we must advance the economic commercial set of interactions at a time that you have big questions in the United States, as you described, and there are elements of the Indian economy that are less open to foreign engagement more directly. I think electronic trade, some of the areas that you have laid out are potentially important and interesting. The devil is in the details, and I think that that's an area to explore more generally between the United States and India. But I think on the one hand, we have to recognize that it's necessary and important because the other elements alone are not enough. But at the same time, Nisha, to recognize that the most important ingredient in the U.S.-India relationship is patience. And I can recall being in Delhi in 2001 when Bob Blackwell and Ashley Tellis were just beginning on this project of really trying to take the U.S.-India relationship to the next level. It's been 20 years and we've made remarkable progress, but at the same time, we have to also recognize the challenges ahead. So I think a sustained, patient approach is going to be important, and a recognition that we have to confront these difficult issues in trade, that it will not be enough to simply say that let's focus on other areas.
Very, very important points, Kurt, and ones that certainly through this platform of the U.S. India Business Council and the U.S. Chamber that we have been pressing with both governments. But let me ask you, how does the rest of the region look at the U.S.-India relationship? When you look at our treaty allies of Korea, Japan, Australia, when you look at the ASEAN community, how do they see a burgeoning partnership between the U.S. and India? And how is it seen in the context of the strategic competition between the United States and China? Give us a little bit of a ASEAN and Asia perspective on this.
So first of all, Anisha, it's a great question, but it's critical to remember that the U.S.-India relationship is not happening in isolation, that at the same time that relationship is deepening, India's relationship with these other countries is also deepening, and in some cases, even more rapidly than what we've seen between the United States and India. For instance, the dialogue, discussion, engagement between India and Japan has seen substantial improvements in the short term. Australia's also improved, and we've seen engagements among Quad countries that involve the United States and sometimes take place without the United States present. It is also the case that in the last several years, India's diplomacy engagement with Southeast Asia has improved substantially, with Singapore, with Indonesia, with other countries, and I expect that to increase. And so most of these countries not only welcome some degree of American engagement with India, but they also value the improving bilateral relationships that they're experiencing with Delhi as well. And so what we have seen, and it's largely through the good work of what you and others have done, is not just the look east, but I like the focus more on action, the act east, the engagement that involves direct diplomacy, trade, and the like that India is experiencing across the Asia Pacific. When I started first working with Indian friends on Asia, we had a good conversation about China, a little bit less on Southeast Asia, some on Japan. That has changed exponentially, Nisha, in which every discussion now with Indian friends has deep, nuanced, fundamental discussions, not only about our bilateral relationship, but what's happening in the region as a whole. And I'm pleased to say that we see eye to eye on many things. And I think in fundamental ways, the U.S.-India relationship is united in common purpose about what we would like to accomplish in the Asia-Pacific region. I think all countries want the United States and India to be purposeful, thoughtful, consistent about China. They do not want to see a descent into a new Cold War, but they also recognize the seriousness with which both countries are engaging about the challenges presented by modern China.
Kurt, as we look at a transition and a focus on what the first 100 days would look like in a Biden administration, we know that there are many, many challenges that are going to be consuming the president-elect, the vice president-elect, and the administration as they assume responsibility on January 20th. We are looking at a world ravaged by the twin challenges of COVID and climate change. We're seeing fractured governance consensus here in the United States, where we have, in many ways, a polarized political frame. Myriad political challenges abroad as well. and crises that need attention, whether it's on U.S. policy in Afghanistan or Yemen, whether it's on the rebuilding and strengthening of our alliance partnerships with our European friends, managing the great power competition with China. Where does and should India fall on that list of priorities, and what should be on kind of the priority list of the first 100 days, and particularly looking also at the Indo-Pacific? What should the incoming administration look at? You very early on in the Obama administration made the case for the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, to focus immediately on Asia, and in fact made her first foreign trip as secretary, made the case for that to be to Asia. So how would you advise the incoming administration, with all of the different things that are on their plate, to think about India and the Indo-Pacific?
Thank Nisha, and you very effectively laid out all the challenges, which are enormous. I would just give a few pieces of advice if I could. The first is to recognize that the United States has a very substantial hole that you have clearly articulated, and it's going to take more than 100 days. We're kind of wired to think of what do you do for the first 100 days. The recognition is that this is going to be a substantial project, and many countries believe that the United States might be in the process of decline. Now, that's happened before in Vietnam and during the Asian financial crisis and the global economic crisis. Each time we've been able to show and demonstrate ability to reinvent ourselves, to march forward. We will have to do that again, and it's going to take all of our resources to do that. There are more questions this time about whether the United States is still interested to play a role globally, the kind of role that has been so beneficial to the region, the creation of this operating system in Asia that has been integral to the maintenance of peace and stability and advancing prosperity. What I would simply say, and I'll just end with this, Nish, and I know, and I appreciate the work that you've done in particular and the chamber in terms of advancing an agenda. What I would like to see is a relatively high-level person inside the U.S. government. I don't care where they're positioned, but probably someone who's involved with the formulation and execution of both diplomacy, trade, and commercial engagement, that basically takes it upon as his or her mission to, at every stage, advance the relationship between the U.S. and India, that really takes it as a mission to focus on every issue, people to people, science exchange, Indian students in American universities, more work together on technology, focusing on strategy, defense cooperation, just across the board, a multifaceted agenda. Some of those things will be difficult. Some of them we might fail, but overall, I think Indian friends would appreciate a high-level, articulate, engaged person that basically makes this his or her mission 24 hours a day.
Well, I think that is a fantastic note on which to conclude our conversation, Kurt. And I know that there are many in both countries that are paying attention to this conversation. So let's hope that that very sage advice falls upon the right ears. I want to thank you for joining us today and being part of today's conversation on the U.S.-India relationship, a post-election perspective. We have heard many perspectives and the need for a relationship that is advanced on a bipartisan basis in both countries, a relationship that is advanced at the state and at the central level. And here at the U.S. India Business Council, we will do our part to make sure that we and our members, that the private sector plays an important role in really helping to realize the full power and potential of the U.S.-India partnership, including most particularly on how to strengthen and animate the economic partnership in ways that can benefit the people of both countries and also help to tackle some of the major challenges we face in the world today. So thank you for joining us. And in the coming days and weeks, the U.S. India Business Council will be pulling together our recommendations for how we can take forward the U.S. India partnership in the coming administration. Stay tuned and stay engaged. Thank you so much for joining us today.